We've encountered the idea multiple times on the show that there is a relationship between the mind and the body in this very medical way. And we've talked to people who have studied Wim Hof, we've talked to people who have studied stress, but something that we've never really talked about is the practice of mindfulness, of meditation, and of the benefits that we can achieve on an individual level by changing the way that we see the world.
And the dangers.
And the dangers. And so today we have our first roundtable conversation. We have Dr. Joe Arpaia and Dr. Lobsang Rapgay. And they, almost like 20 years ago, wrote a book together called Meditation in Minutes a Day. And the idea was that you could basically learn to manage yourself more effectively in a really straightforward and low effort. I don't want to say low effort. You can manage yourself in a straightforward and realistic way. And so we have them on the show today to talk about stress, about dissatisfaction, about the hedonic treadmill, and about the way that our internal states play out on the world that we live in and how the world that we live in feeds back onto ourselves. And it's a fantastic conversation. They have a lot of insight onto the human condition, onto the social condition.
And onto what's happening in the world right now, why everything feels like it's on fire, and what we can, I'm not sure that we've solved that issue, but there are some steps we can take, and we're working towards those in all of our discussions actually here. So if you like this podcast, please share it with somebody. This is how we reach new people. This is how we get better and better guests. Also, if you have thoughts, please leave comments and talk to us. Talk to all of the other people that are listening so we can move these ideas forward as we go.
And if you've already done that and you want to help more, support us on Patreon. We're at patreon.com/demystifysci. That's how we can make more of these and how we can get better and better.
Yeah, we're putting that money all back into this project. So we're going to take this show on the road. We're going to find a way to technologically do these podcasts in real time so people can actually participate in the discussions. But we need help. So even if you can only give a couple bucks a month, it will add up. It is adding up already. So thank you guys so much if you are already supporting us. Otherwise, enjoy this conversation.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
The concept of anxiety. Anxiety is defined as excessive concern about a future-oriented issue or a problem. And it's actually a survival mechanism we all need. Anxiety is very important for our performance, for protecting us and preparing us for unexpected or perceived threats and situations. So it's very critical to survival. The problem is when it becomes excessive and interferes with our day-to-day functioning, such as social and occupational functioning, then it can become pathological. So it's something that however, the problem with anxiety is one needs to understand that it's driven by a core fear. And the psychoanalytical people, of course, attribute it to the death instinct, which is a fear of being annihilated when the infant feels like in the darkness, without the mental capacity it has yet to develop. The darkness and the absence of the mother breast when it's hungry produce intense fear of being not only deprived, but also destroyed. And that fear is then projected out into the external world. And so it, after a while, begins to see the darkness, begins to look in the room and sees that the cupboard is dark. And it's actually its own fear that has been projected out. And it then reacts to the darkness as something threatening. And that's where anxiety really starts. It's a fear-based. But today, most of our approach to anxiety is primarily treating it as a cognitive disorder and kind of paying less attention to its core issue, which is its underlying fear of the unknown, and particularly the intolerance for uncertainty, which is derived from fear of the unknown. And so animals, you will find it, a lot of the research on fear actually derives from animal models. And with borderline, it's more complex. It's something found more in women. Generally, it's a splitting of one's thoughts into good and bad, one's affect into good and bad, and therefore it becomes very difficult in the interpersonal context to know when the person and is at and how to respond to them, because they shift between different opposing thoughts and opposing feelings, because their perception of you is also split. They can see you as a very good person at one time, and within 1 hour can see you as depriving, withholding, and then begin to react to that. So it's a very difficult disorder to treat, though they are very promising and good current treatments for it. Yet it's still a field that requires, further research and development.
Is that a modern phenomenon, or is borderline? Where does this come
I
from?
would imagine it existed throughout history. Narcissistic and borderline, they are within the same spectrum. And you know that narcissistic personalities exist throughout history. Of course, identifying and classifying it as such is more recent. And of course, modern lifestyle certainly amplifies the borderline personality in a way probably we haven't seen it in the past, because modern lifestyle does play a big role in the amplification of the personality traits that are defined as borderline.
Is that because people can casually enter and leave relationships really easily, and the choices? Yeah, I'm just curious, like what has changed?
Choices, whereas in the older times, the social constrictions were huge, and the price of, separating was enormous, that you would think many times over taking that risk. But that inhibition no longer exists, and this sense of freedom allows the borderline, if you have a borderline trait, it gives further permission for it to act out.
Interesting.
Is it called borderline because you're always on the border of one of these extreme, or like you're split between these extreme positions on things, or what is that? It's a strange name.
Yes, the simple reason is split between a psychotic and the neurotic. You kind of are in the border of that. When there's stress, you will move into the psychotic expressions or manifestation. And when you are calm and collected, you will move into the neurotic. But it's very fluid. So you'll find a lot of borderlines are attracted to spiritual quests, because they will move from extremes. They are extremely attracted to spiritual endeavors, and they can do quite well under optimal conditions, such as ones that are very nurturing, containing. But once the conflict arises within that containment or environment, then they can act out in ways that can be quite traumatic for everybody concerned in that community.
It makes me go back
to...
to
problem.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Did you have something else to add?
No, please go ahead. Yeah. Yes, that's
it makes me think of the assessment stage, because it seems like Dr. Arpaia was saying earlier, that in the remediation of anxiety and these programs that you're really focusing on taking a step back and reassessing the situation. It might not be as it first appeared to you. And it seems like in the case of this disorder you're speaking of, there's some sort of mismatch at the assessment stage in these individuals. And is that driven by the high pace of the modern times, or how do you treat that?
Well, there's a distinction between anxiety disorder and borderline. Borderline is a personality trait. It's kind of an inborn. It's a part of your personality, whereas the anxiety disorder is, you may have predisposition to anxiety genetically, but it's a disorder. It's access, to diagnosis, and there's a difference between what groups they fall into. So with borderline, it's not so. It's true. There's a issue with assessment of the environment, but it's more that's how they are. It's built into their personality. It originates with a depriving or overbearing, over-controlling mother. And trauma can play a role, exacerbate the situation, but trauma alone doesn't lead to cause a borderline condition, though it can exacerbate it. It's more the family environment in which you are raised. If you have an absent father or an alcoholic father and a mother that is withdrawn and depressed, then the child's development of particularly its perceptual and cognitive processes, and including the affective, they become complicated. It doesn't know how to distinguish between what is good and what is bad, when to respond to each and how to respond. And thus, it uses more primitive mechanisms that are within it.
Yeah, what's the child experiencing in that environment? Like, what's going on in the mind of that child that leads them to form these very fast assessments that might be polarizing to some?
From everything that I've heard, the most successful treatment for borderline is Marshall Linehan's skills training, right? Where it's basically there's
a very good training, yes, but also psychoanalytical psychotherapy has shown to be equally effective treatment. The dialectic or the Linehan's treatment is, in terms of research base, is the most researched, and is seen as the most effective. That's absolutely true. It's primarily a skill-based training. And thus, skills-based training means you identify a behavioral or a cognitive problem that the patient is exhibiting, assess it, and then address that by providing a particular appropriate skill. On the other hand, the psychoanalytical looks more at the psychodynamics. What motivates a child to behave in this extreme manner in a particular situation? And it looks at the primitive way it perceives the world without realizing that much of its perception, misperceptions are determined by its projection of its awful feelings of being neglected, abandoned, ignored, humiliated onto the caregiver. And now the caregiver is seen as depriving and a person who hates the child, and the child thus develops a defensive stance towards. And it's caught in that virtual world. And the only way it gets respite is maybe it finds a doll, or it fantasizes that there's a good mother and there's an angel, and it, in its mind or fantasies, play with it. And that's where it seeks its the good caregiving, but it's fantasy. It's a creation of its own mind, which helps us to survive, but prevents it from actually finding real caregiving from a real lived person. And that's the downside of it. So until we address that underlying issue, the borderline, issues, it's difficult to treat. That issue can still persist in spite of good skills they learn to manage day-to-day splitting that occurs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complex. It's a complex disorder.
Yeah, I mean, like anything, I think that anytime that you start, messing around with what happens to people after they've grown up in what amounts to not a very good childhood, I imagine that it's going to be complicated because all of those things manifest in many different ways.
That's
but
right.
I wanted to see if we can connect this back to the work that Dr. Arpaia is doing, where, when I think of the underlying problem with anxiety or something like borderline, it's trauma and a lack of skills. And I find it hard to imagine that you could build a police department or any kind of law enforcement agency that isn't full of people that are filled with trauma and have not great skills. Because that's just, the framework for the world also. And
Right.
so how do you deal with that? Like, what is your perception of this?
Well, I don't think the police officers are any more traumatized than the general public. In fact, I think they start out a healthier bunch because they have to go through screening and some training, and especially depending on the department, there's more or less training involved. Some of that training can be quite intense. I conceptualize anxiety somewhat in the following way. There's something I'll call unease. And unease is desire for something you don't have. It's not an intellectual I want. It's this feeling of I want that. I've got to have that. I think in Buddhist psychology, I think they sometimes call this craving. So it's a very visceral experience. And the counterpart to desire is aversion, which is the same thing, sort of pushing away. So desire is I want this, I want to get that. There's a pull toward the object. Aversion is there's a push away. And we all feel that. And we don't like it. And when it goes down, we experience pleasure. So pleasure is a reduction in unease. We get what we want, we avoid what we don't want. And what we call emotion, like anxiety, is unease in a context. So there's the feeling of unease, and the context of threat makes us feel anxious. If the context is loss, it makes us feel sad. If the context is I'm not making progress, we may call that frustration. So unease in context gives you your emotion. And when I think of anxiety, there's another component. So unease is I'll call it one form of stress. The environment causes unease. The environment also puts demands on us. So that's another form of stress, the demands compared to the resources we have to deal with them. So let's say a concrete example, bills. If my bills are X amount and I have a salary that's about that much, then my difficulty is not so bad. If my bills are greater than my income, I have a high difficulty situation. If my income goes up, my difficulty goes down. So there's this interplay between demands and resources that creates difficulty. Difficulty and unease exist together. We assess difficulty, we appraise unease. And I just wrote a blog post in response to a CNN article that I was quoted in, explaining a bit more about anxiety. And I defined 4 types. There's unease is high and difficulty is low. And this is typically what I think we see in generalized anxiety disorder. There's really no pressing. I mean, we all have demands and stuff, but there's nothing really pressing. But they're uneasy, they're anxious, and there's this sense of this looming threat. Something's wrong, something's going to happen, something bad's going to happen. That's one type of anxiety. Another type of anxiety is where the unease is artificially high because the person's appraising their life as being falling short. So advertisers, our culture, there's all sorts of pressures to, keep up with the Joneses, to want more. And a person can then develop these desires that are way overblown and cause a lot of problems. Long time ago, I had a patient come in for his intake, and the question was, is he manic? And he was actually in this very agitated, anxious state. And he had a good job, he had a family, and he decided he was going to run his own business, and it was going to happen right away. And he was working these insane hours to get his own business started. And it was driving him crazy, and he was really going to lose his family and probably his health, given how hard he was pushing. And my sense was his unease was artificially high. He really had nothing to be uneasy about. His difficulty was manageable. I gave him a reappraisal assignment. I said, I want you to fast forward, 50 some odd years in the future, and you're at your own funeral. And what are people saying about you? What are your wife and kids saying about you? And how much of it does it have to do with you running your own company? What do you want people to be saying about you when you're dead? And I told him, come back in 2 weeks.
That is such a hard exercise to do. I think everybody should do that once a day, actually.
He said it was a very hard exercise, but it completely reoriented him. And he said his anxiety was gone. He had reconnected with his family. He said, if I want to run my own business, I'll do it in a sustainable way. That's something I'll back off.
But it could have just as easily come out that he came back to you and was like, no, I want to be remembered for the business, right?
Right. I took a risk. But that would have been his choice then. Then it would have been, in other words, his unease, what he was doing is, no, this is really my value system. This is what I want to live for.
There's like a mismatch of some sort.
Right.
That's where the pain was coming from.
Right.
Because I guess if you decide like, I want to actually devote myself to.
Yeah, it's like, screw my family.
Yeah, it's like, I probably shouldn't be married then. That's fine. Yeah. And that's what I'm going to do.
Or he renegotiates with his family to let them know this is really, this is a true core value for me. Okay. But what he'd done is he'd gotten values that were kind of, he was keeping up with some of his friends who had their own companies and stuff. And so it's like, no, this wasn't his real core value. So it was making him want something that he didn't really want. That's what I mean by unease artificially high. And advertising does that. Our culture tends to do that. We have to be on guard for that. Another kind of anxiety is when difficulty is artificially high. Then that occurs when we're missing our resources. Where, we see the demands as greater than the resources because we're overestimating demands and we're underestimating resources. And people tend to do, that's why there's a saying, don't make mountains out of molehills. We tend to, oh my God, that's so hard. And well, you got these, look around you, you've got some resources. And that really responds, that kind of anxiety responds to reassessment skills. You need to, start, make a list of what you really need to accomplish. Maybe you have more time than you have. Maybe you can get more time. What are your social connections? And so
I guess
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. And then the fourth type of anxiety, and I deal a lot with people with the fourth type of anxiety, where they're anxious because their difficulty is really high. I work with a number of my patients are publicly funded, so they're on an Oregon health plan. And I sometimes don't know how in the heck they do it. They're single parents, they have low income jobs, they're juggling enormous numbers of demands, and they have very few resources. And for them, anxiety, it's like, well, of course they're anxious. And what I'm helping them do is, sometimes using my position to try to get some extra, here, check with this agency, you maybe have some resources here, maybe we can get the demands lowered. You have to play, it's like it's really social work to treat the anxiety.
That's kind of where I wanted to go, which is that there is a subset of people who are genuinely in positions of lack, right? They don't have the resources that they need, and the society is structured in such a way that it's not for them the way that it should be. And that seems like the category of like people need help that isn't necessarily psychological. They need material help. But
Right.
then there's this other aspect where people are just experiencing difficult emotions where, the unease and the difficulty aren't necessarily matched. And in that context, I wonder, and this is kind of a question for both of you, how do people react to being told, okay, you can fix this versus there's a pill that can fix this?
I actually had someone ask me, because she wasn't responding well to medications, and she had what Lobsang has described, the borderline personality disorder. So her relationships were always very, very, they were very anxiety, charged with anxiety. And she actually asked me, don't you just have a magic pill that I can take and will fix all my problems? I mean, that's a quote. And the answer is no. We don't. It's very often for a lot of people, it's a combination of we have to do something to the environment and you have to respond differently to that environment. And both are needed. And go ahead, Lobsang.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the case. I mean, you to explain to them that you to explain to them the benefits, particularly if their symptoms are such that they are having enormous amount of functioning problems to the point that it could disrupt their family life or occupational responsibilities, then you might suggest that they take medication for a while. But overall, you basically, if that's not the case, then you give to educate them of the benefits and the side effects of taking medication and the evidence that psychotherapy and medication overall seem to have pretty much the same outcome for certain type of disorders. And if they fall into one of those disorders for which the outcomes are the same, then you would encourage them first, if their symptoms are not extremely disruptive and dysfunctional, to first try out psychotherapy as the pathway first, because it has the outcome is pretty much the same and does not pose the risk of side effects that medication could for this particular patient. But you do need to, for psychologists, you need to consult a psychiatrist at the same time. The therapist needs to, in regards to the patient, and see what the psychiatrist feels about your recommendation.
And one does, it's not either or. I find that medications seem to, anxiety is a disorder that tends to feed on itself. So a lot of times it's the person feels uneasy for maybe because difficulty is high or for other reasons, but the unease causes unease. So they're actually uneasy about feeling uneasy. So there's this feeling, the unease is aversive, and that causes more unease. Well, now you have a feedback loop. Sometimes the unease causes body experiences that are uncomfortable. So the person gets uneasy about the sympathetic activation, the change of heart palpitations or tension or butterflies in the stomach. That's another feedback loop. You might say it's more between the midbrain and the brainstem, whereas the unease feeding on itself is a midbrain loop. Now, a beta blocker will tend to inhibit that feedback loop between the anxiety and the somatic symptoms. So the person, that's why performers use beta blockers so much. It blunts that sympathetic activation, and blunts the feedback loop. So you don't have the feedback loop, you don't have a problem. SSRIs, SNRIs, medications, those seem to blunt that unease itself. The unease doesn't cause as much unease. It's blunting that feedback loop. I used the analogy. I said, it's kind of like the anxiety is like having your finger in a light socket, and the SSRI, your finger's still in the light socket, but now you've got a neoprene glove on. So you're not feeling the current as much. And one of the most common side effects of SSRIs, which are very commonly given for anxiety, or the SNRIs, is a blunting of emotional experience. So it's like it dampens emotional experience, which again, very important because it allows someone to work on the psychotherapeutic techniques because the intensity of the experience is blunted, so they actually can, work through the process. I've had people who've worked with a therapist other than myself, or sometimes with me, and after a while, they'll tell me, I'd like to come down on the medication. Because I want to feel more. Now I can feel, I've got more resilience. I have more capacity to feel negative affect, negative emotions. I'd like to cry at a sad movie. So now we start coming down very carefully on the medication, moving at a rate that their brain can adjust to, which sometimes takes months. But then they're able to have a more full range of emotion and not get overwhelmed.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you make? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention, that, by the way, the one, in addition to psychotherapy, there's a growing interest in using mindfulness actually for treating anxiety disorders as well as depression. The data for depression, particularly for 3 or more recurrence of depressive episodes. Mindfulness has shown great promise, in preventing further relapse, which medication hasn't been able to acquire. So, there are increasing evidence that mindfulness can be very helpful for depression, for anxiety and depression. Though the literature is it's in very early stages, and often many of the studies don't use, active control. Active control is the one where you control, you incorporate all the components of the active treatment, such as mindfulness, and use a control group that has all the other components that the mindfulness treatment has, except for mindfulness, and then test the two groups. The problem is when active control has been used to study current forms of westernized mindfulness, the data doesn't look the same. It's not as effective as when active controls have not been used, whether it's about the claim about change, MBSR or mindfulness, westernized mindfulness, changing the structure of the brain, or whether it's about the core, therapeutic ingredient, active ingredient of MBSR, which is sustained attention. Has been shown that when active control was used, MBSR subjects did no better than the control in terms of attentional measures. So that is as well as what type of instruments you use to measure the different components, active components of mindfulness, such as sustained attention. You need to use a measure that involves at least 20 minutes of sustained attention. If you don't use a measure that measures attention for at least 20 minutes, then it's very hard to claim that sustained attention is improved by a particular measure. So there are many problems currently underlying, the study of mindfulness, and that's why it's. And not only that, in all of its, there are increasing studies coming out with other active ingredients of mindfulness or mechanisms of MBSR, such as non-judgmental, attitude, which is one of the core therapeutic ingredients that makes MBSR so successful, certainly in a clinical context. But recent research has shown that, teaching people to be non-judgmental via mindfulness resulted in them feeling less guilty. And when they felt less guilty, they were less likely to apologize for something they did wrong. So their reparative pro-social behavior decreased. And in our society today, actually, I remember a couple of years ago, I did a grand rounds for the UCLA Veterans Hospital. And this was about 10 years ago. I brought up these issues because MBSR was being used by many of the psychiatric residents at the veterans. And I brought up this issue. I said, if I had a child, at that time I didn't, so if I had a child, I wouldn't encourage them to learn how to be non-judgmental at that 5-6 years old. Their brains are just not developed enough to learn that high-level cognitive functioning. They need to learn a more basic core cognitive functioning, which is to learn to judge between right and wrong, good friends and bad friends, good behavior and bad behavior. So I would not at all. And clearly, 10 years later, in this famous recent study that came out from Europe, primarily from Oxford, where they studied 28,000 students between, I think, age 11 to 14, over 600 schools or something. I'm not sure how many schools. It's a huge 8-year, massive research. And what they found out that in the protocol that was used, which is primarily inspired by MBSR, was they found out that actually in terms of social and emotional issues, MBSR was actually quite derived mindfulness that they provided was actually quite harmful to many of the students who had emotional problems. And then the majority of them only practiced the mindfulness practice only once a week. Probably, I think they practiced for the 8 weeks that they were taught. They practiced only a couple of times or even just once, because the reason was majority of them said, it's very boring to practice it. So that led the researchers, many of them, to now suggest that maybe we should not, universally prescribe MBSR-based mindfulness to children at large. We should be very cautious. We should identify those children who it may benefit and apply it to them. But for others, maybe more teaching social and emotional skills, the standard skills from a psychological perspective and behavioral perspective may be better. So this is leading, at least in my work, is leading me to go back to the original teachings of mindfulness that the Buddha himself, it said, practiced in the 6 years when he worked towards enlightenment under the Buddha tree, and the teachings which is enshrined in the 5 suttas. The suttas are like the Bible in the sense that they are many people, scholars and others believe they enshrine the actual teachings of the Buddha. And there are 5 of them, all of which, present the 4 foundations of mindfulness as the Buddha practice. So I'm looking at those.
And what are those?
Those are, quite interesting. If you read those, they are worlds apart from the westernized or the modern. I wouldn't say westernized. I would say the Burmese modernized version of mindfulness. In all religious traditions, it starts out with a very philosophical, concrete, pragmatic approach. And then over time, you have, you have other teachers come along and then mystify the religious traditions. Suddenly it becomes mystical. It becomes, it becomes something more than what the original teaching was taught. And there may be something to that in Buddhist, how Buddhism has evolved. And that's why it seems important to go back to the original, what is happening now in the West, certainly. There's a strong group of Buddhist teachers in the West who are now going back to what they called early Buddhism, which even predates to some extent the Pali Theravadan form of Buddhism, and trying to flesh out what was the real teachings of the Buddha. And while I think that's very important, but I think one of the danger which I can see happen is many of them then dismiss the subsequent richness of that other teachers have brought over to the Buddhism, to ones that are incredibly, rich and offer are ones that can allow Buddhism to, in these current days, enrich our perspective and how we see world problems and our role in it, such as the issue of emptiness and compassion, which are post-Buddhist Buddha's, teachings that other teachers much later, 300 years after the Buddha passed away, brought. So, we are going through a incredible metamorphosis as the West looks at Buddhism. And as you know, with Buddhism, whichever country it goes to, it incorporates that country's culture and traditions and philosophies into the mix. And we are seeing this happening in a very rich way in the West today. It's not kind of evident, but it's happening very slowly. And I think it's a wonderful process unfolding.
Yeah.
Before I want to clarify though, what are the 5 teachings that are foundational there?
Oh, sorry about that. I meant to.
That's fine.
First is the mindfulness on the body, then on feelings. Feelings here is not emotions. They are differentiated in the Buddha. And it's very important to make that distinction, because now new research in cognitive science is actually showing that the core underlying source for emotion is feelings. Feelings here refers to our reaction to sensations, bodily sensations. There are 3 types of sensation, two main types of responses to bodily sensation: pleasurable and unpleasurable. And these 2 responses form the core. These are the invariant core basis for then emotions evolving later. And this is now being presented by, like Professor Barnett has a similar view, which the Buddhists have been talking about for thousands of years. The third foundation is thought and emotions, using mindfulness to study the mechanisms of thought and emotions. And finally, the 4th foundation is how to overcome resistance we have towards using mindfulness to study the body, to study feelings, to study thought and emotions, and how after you overcome the resistance, then you begin to pursue the 4 noble truths. There are 4 truths: that life is suffering, that there is a cause of suffering, and there is a state that is free from suffering, and how to reach that state which is free from suffering. So those are the the four foundations of Buddhism. But the key concept here is the two methods used to work through these four foundations. One is sustained attention. Sustained attention has two purposes, is to understand a particular object in its entirety, all its component, and store it in long-term memory, so that when you do that, you no longer have to put effort in working with that sustained attention, right? Like bicycling. When you learn how to bicycle, that's what happens. That's one purpose. The second purpose is what mindfulness is really interested in. It's to inhibit our projections onto our experiences. So if I see a car, it teaches me not to instinctively give into my urge to see it as beautiful because I like the red color of the car, but instead to see first, inhibit that projection and to see the car as simply as a car. Now, when you take it to bodily experiences, feelings, thoughts, and emotions, then that's where the meat of this practice really speaks to us, because everything is a projection, right? We are driven by biases, implicit biases, preferences, and from a psychoanalytical perspective, attachment to what we like or what gives us pleasure, aversion towards what we hate. And so the second type of method used in mindfulness is metacognition. This is really important because metacognition is learning how to observe your own thoughts, feelings, emotions, and behavior and see its consequence on the external world. Once you are aware of it, then you need to, metacognition further inquires, how did you learn that? How did you, what causes it? And what amplifies, exacerbates it, and then how you can remedy it or modify it. That's called metacognition. And unfortunately, in the Buddhist current presentation of four foundations of mindfulness ignores these two methods. They describe it very vaguely, but they immediately jump into presenting the four foundations. So until you learn, for instance, metacognition, they simply state it as, it's simply being aware of your thoughts and feelings. But that's not metacognition. That's just one step. You have to go further using metacognitive mechanisms. The two together, skills together, are incredibly powerful. If you're a student, you learn. Why do I didn't pass the exams? What mistakes did I make it? It's not enough to know what mistakes you made, but know why you made it. And that requires metacognitive abilities, not simply reading or listening to your professor who says, you failed because you failed to answer this question in this way. And that's very helpful. But you need to ask yourself, why did you answer that question? The professor can tell you, you failed because you answered this question in this way, but you need to ask, why did I do that? And this is a laborious process, but it's been shown students who do that, use metacognition, do much better than students who don't.
It's interesting because it brings back what Dr. Arpaia was talking about at the beginning with stepping back and assessing the situation. And it's kind of crazy how well that works when you pull it off, how if you just are able to detach momentarily from the chaos that's surrounding you and just get a new perspective on things. You might notice things that you hadn't noticed before, and they can stabilize your perspective. And another thing I wanted to comment on is that the Eastern tradition here, and my understanding is you actually came from a very deep Buddhist background as well, which I'd like to hear more about soon. But it also parallels a somewhat revived tradition in the West, which is Stoicism, which is also about separating yourself from your immediate feelings so that you can assess them. And it seems like, I don't know, it just seems like assessment is really the gold that's at the heart of a lot of these therapies, like self-assessment.
Yeah, if I could talk, because when I see patients, which I do frequently during the week, they've told me one of the most powerful methods is to be able to distinguish difficulty from unease. So unease is what you want in the moment. It's your feeling. I want this, or I want to get away from that. Difficulty is what's important based on your value system. And we get confused about the two. We think that, this is what I want, and that's what's important. It's like, no. And a lot of times what you have to do is realize, okay, I have to tolerate the unease in order to reduce the difficulty, which brings down unease slowly. Okay, and so when teaching people, to be aware of their thought, I talk about, we're not going to talk about right and wrong or good and bad. What we're going to do is look, what's helpful? Is it helpful? Is this reducing my difficulty, or is it unhelpful? Is this increasing my difficulty? If I want to ignore a task because it's aversive, okay, well, is that making my life more difficult or less difficult in the long run? It's making my life more difficult. Okay, that I have to be able to push through the unease in order to do the task. And one of the ways I do that is I call it attentional discipline. If I focus my attention on what's making me uneasy, then the unease goes up, and it feels impossible to resist. If I focus my attention on the importance of the task and the people who will benefit from it, then I'm much more likely to be able to do the task. Here's an example I use to separate difficulty and unease. Imagine there's a board on the ground. It's, 18 inches wide, it's 50 feet long, it's nice and thick, and your task is to walk from one end of the board to the other. That's an easy task. If the board is narrower, we have a 4-inch board, that's a harder task. So the width of the board is a resource. And if you have a lot of resource wide, it's easier than if it's narrow. Okay, take the wide board, 18 inches wide. It's almost as wide as a sidewalk. Put it up 300 feet in the air. Okay, it's the same board, but there's something very different about the task. And that's the unease we all tend to have about walking out over 300 feet of space without guardrails. And that unease will tend to grab our attention. We're looking down. We've lost sight of the board. Our heart rate goes up. We have physiologic changes from that unease that actually can make it harder to walk. So our ability to balance may go down. How do you deal with that? I've been in places where I've had to walk, been at high elevation. You focus on the board. You don't look down, you look at the board. Now, let's say someone is, there's a task that's really important. There's a little kid on the other side of at the other end of the board, and they're starting to crawl out on that board. Now you've got someone to rescue. First responders know this. You focus on, oh my gosh, I've got to take care of this person. And now you're not even aware of the unease. In fact, sometimes in first responders, we have to tell them, no, you got to be aware of your situation so you don't run out in front of traffic. Okay, so again, it's using this attentional discipline. What Lobsang was talking about, the sustained attention, what you learn is this attentional discipline, how to direct your attention to what's important and keep it there without a lot of effort. And if it gets distracted, you realize it and you bring it back. And then your metacognitive skills start to help you understand this is helpful, this is not helpful. We don't have to say bad, good, it's not helpful.
Yeah, the reorientation towards goals is something that I just see play out all the time in my own life. Like, we do a lot of rock climbing, and I noticed something really interesting a while back, which is that the more difficult routes are often less scary because you're actually so fixated on completing the moves that you don't really have time to like look around and be like, oh my God, I'm 100 feet off the deck. And what if this piece of gear doesn't hold and all these things that, because the climbing is not taking your attention. And it's so fascinating too, because I think the Stoics would agree that a lot of the pain in your life comes from paying attention to problems that you can't control. And I think if you're on a plank, 500 feet off the ground, you can't control the fact that, you're 500 feet off the ground. So it's probably not what you should be paying attention to. How do you strengthen that ability? Like, how can we maybe we don't actually go to therapy or work on these things? How can we do it at home every day to actually strengthen our attention towards the things that matter?
Well, Lobsang and I wrote a book many years ago that goes into some of these techniques.
You did.
So get the book, everybody.
20 years ago, right?
Real meditation in minutes a day.
Well, you could, with sustained attention, from a Buddhist perspective, and also which now is the basis for all, research using mindfulness for developing sustained attention, is to focus it on a gross part of oneself rather than abstract like thoughts or emotions. Start with focusing on the body, particularly the breath, because that's something you can feel, and it's in that sense, it's a concrete object. And you follow your breath and the key is to first relax and make sure you're not breathing too much from the chest, but more from the abdomen. And then when you can choose a spot at the inner part of your nostril, and you select that as the spot to feel the breath as you inhale and exhale. And your attention should begin at the start of the inhalation, go to follow the breath right through the end of it, and similarly do it when you exhale. And when you get distracted, don't be critical about the distraction. Simply note that, you are distracted, and come back to the breath again and again. And the key thing is, before you begin meditation, doing this practice, you've really got to establish a positive and a motivational attitude that this is going to help me. I really want to do this. I'll start with just 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening. And that there will be some goals. My first goal would be just for 10 seconds, holding my attention on the movement of the breath from the beginning and I will see if I can achieve that in 3 days. And then increase it to 15 seconds. If you can, ultimate goal is to achieve about 1 minute if you can. It takes quite a bit of challenge, but half a minute is a really good target, practical target to work towards. And when you achieve that for a week, you can repeat that performance, then you can shift to sensations in the body. Like you just stay calm, start with the breath, but then don't put all your attention on the breath. Just say whatever comes up from my body, whatever sensation comes up that catches my mind, I'm going to attend to that now. So as you focus on your breath, you're open. Now this is called open attentional training. You're opening your attention by not having a fixed object, because you've mastered that component you are able to do it for half a minute or a minute now. So that's a good place to start. Now you can say, okay, I'm going to broaden my attention and I'm just going to start focusing on the breath, but then keep my mind open to any sensation that the body presents me with. And suddenly you'll notice a tickle or a tightness in your back, and let that tightness come into your awareness, and you then, from your part, direct your attention to focus on that sensation. And just stay on the sensation without judging it, without evaluating it is a better word, and stay with it. And then you will get the first benefit of this practice, which is you'll notice the sensation will disappear. Now, the moment you react and say, oh, it hurts, it's been there a long time, the moment you have these two types of thoughts, it will increase and your frustration will increase. So both the subject and the object will be triggers for you to disrupt your practice. So whereas if you don't evaluate it and stay with it, the sensation will decrease. And at that time you say, wow, you need to reinforce this is really helpful. It helps to remove this faster than it normally does. And then you can begin to apply it to a slight headache you might have, and you will see it really works. With generalized anxiety disorder patients, most of those who come to me, a majority will first complain about physiological symptoms, not about their cognitive distortions and their fears, but I have a headache, I have butterflies in my stomach, I have muscle ache, I can't sleep, I'm very restless, I move around all the time, and you have to address that. And this is one of the most effective techniques I've found to give them evidence. With therapy patients, we don't have magic pills or things to offer. We can't do surgery on them, etc. As psychologists, we have to, within 2-3 sessions, provide them with something that works, where experientially they see it works. Otherwise, they will drop out of therapy. I found this one of the techniques that really works. So maybe Joe, if you like to.
Yeah. And the breathing techniques are very powerful. And I like to tell people that the real practical thing about the breath is it's there. You don't, if it's not there, you got a whole different set of problems.
It's free too.
It's free. It's right. It's free. But there's actually lots of ways to practice especially in our busy environment. One of the things I'll do is I'll open a web page, where it's like a news site or something like that, or just some of the a magazine. It's like, so I'm looking at the web page, and of course there's one article, and then there's all these other articles, and then there's ads that are popping up, and that's a really good training aid, because it's okay. I want to keep my attention on this one article, and then I'll watch my attention. Oh, what about no, not helpful. Oh, there's this. Oh, what about it's just you can watch your attention being pulled. And you get practice at just keeping it on one thing. Or I've noticed that if I have a website open and I'm trying to work on let's say I'm working on a document, and so my browser's open in the corner, I haven't closed it. And at first I used to realize, oh man, that's really distracting. I need to close it. Or my email program, I need to close it. So that helps me get the work done. But as an attentional training tool, it's really helpful to leave them open. So my email program's open on my desktop, and I'm working on the document, and it goes ping, and I'll watch my attention start to get pulled. Oh, and it gives me the opportunity to practice. No, not helpful. Ignore that. Just stay working on the document. So again, if my purpose is to just work on the document and really get focused on that and ignore it, then I'll close off all the distractions. But sometimes the very distractions that make our life difficult, we can be used as training aids to help us learn to not just stay focused, but if I start getting distracted, to pull back really quickly. I call it unhooking. Our attention gets hooked. Practice unhooking. Unhooking is different than staying on track. It's a little bit like, I'm jumping around here, I'm sorry. But if you're riding a bicycle, you're almost never really balanced over your wheels. You're always wobbling a bit. So what happens is you get off balance, your brain notices that and very quickly brings you back over your balance point. And a skilled writer actually does that more frequently than an unskilled writer. An unskilled writer doesn't notice. They get off balance, and then, oh no, I have to recorrect, and it's really hard to correct accurately, and they fall. But as you get more skilled, you notice that you're getting off balance. And when you watch someone who's a skilled writer, it looks like they're balanced over their wheel, but the fact is they're wobbling imperceptibly. And so one way of developing our attention is to learn to unhook. Yes, we want to sustain attention, but we also need to be able to unhook very quickly. And I think that's what Lobsang was talking about. You start to broaden your awareness. You can see the big picture, but you're not getting hooked by anything and then going off down a rabbit hole where, of other things. You go, oh, okay, that. What else? What else? And so you're building this big picture with the context of here's what I'm centered on, and here's my purpose, and here's what I want to accomplish. And you're bringing in lots of other avenues and angles and perspectives, and you're able to take that big picture because you're able to unhook from things that would otherwise drag you away.
Yeah, I really like that. I can't remember who I read saying this a while ago, but they were like, look, meditation is fantastic, but we tend to practice it in this way where we lock ourselves away from the world. And so it's something that you do in a quiet room with no disturbances, and that's the only place where you're able to find this centering. But the reality of it is that you need to be able to find that center when there are a million things that are demanding the attention of you. And so the unhooking seems like it's a move in that direction where it allows you to really recognize that you're not disengaging from the world, because that's the place where you have to be able to practice this.
Yeah, and also in the 4 foundations that the Buddha taught, if you look under the body mindfulness, actually there he amplifies the practice from a secluded internal process to, all types of movement, walking, when you're walking, when you're sitting, when you're lying down. So, that issue has been recognized very early on in the meditative tradition. The thing is, in the West, we've developed because of the enormous, busy lives people lead. We've in the West, we've designed the teaching or practice of meditation through retreats. So weekend retreats, week retreats. And once you you opt for that model, then that model encourages, sitting as a group, sitting individually for long periods of time, then a short period of discussion, etc. And that concept has been amplified to personal, practice at home too. People have said, "Oh, wow, it really feels good to just sit by myself because my life is so busy out there. It's full of noise the moment I step out of my house." And so that's more a cultural phenomena, because in the East, I think mindfulness and meditation has been practiced more, is incorporated into daily life more, much more so. For instance, the monks, right? When they eat, you go to the forest monks in Thailand, for instance, when they wash their containers after their meals, that's a time to practice mindfulness.
It's interesting that you say that, because that's something that I've noticed, where when I'm washing dishes or I'm doing any kind of cleaning, if you can focus really just on your hands, right, and just the action of the hands as they do the task, it's a completely different experience, and it's very meditative and it's very calming.
And that would be the mindfulness of feeling. You just feeling are really the sensation. You just feel the sensation. As soon as you project a thought, then you stop that thought, because it will disrupt the experience of sensation. And once you get to know sensation, you will see, oh gee, I can stay with the sensation because I find it pleasurable. There's a certain sense of gratification. Okay, let me see if I stop that and just experience the sensation, the feeling. You'll notice the feeling is simply a sensation. It's your fingertips contacting the dish, and it's merely a sensation. And then you will have this internal battle or struggle. I don't want to give up this pleasurable feeling, but yet I'm confronted with the fact that feelings' core nature is pure sensation. And that's what the Buddha wanted you to struggle with, through these practices. But, but at the start, you really need to shift away from thinking and move to sensation, feeling. That's a big step you are taking, because you are quietening down feeling, because you're recognizing that feeling colors your experience of sensation. Like you are sensing it, and then you say, "Oh, after this, what should I do?" Like I have to go and make a call, and suddenly you see this being fully present. One famous psychoanalyst who revolutionized psychoanalysis is Wilfred Bion. He was born in India during the British time. He fought in I think he was a captain in the Second World War. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is, one of the highest awards for bravery. And he developed the Travers. Anyway, because his exposure to the East as well as Western philosophy, which he brought into the understanding of psychoanalysis, he would say how when he gardens, he loved gardening. The last few years of his life, he moved to Los Angeles, and he would love gardening. And at that time, that was all he would focus on, the sensation of gardening. He would hear the phone ring in his office, but he would shut it out. And here you have a psychoanalyst, who already understood, the concept of mindfulness practice. And he incorporated, and that became a very important component of his reinterpreting of psychoanalysis. This sense, or what he described as the O experience, the unknowable. It's a direct experience. If you try to describe it, you instantly move to thinking, and that contaminates the experience. The experience is lost. And that is the long term, it takes several months to years to have that experience. But Bion had that experience, because everything he did, like you mentioned, whatever you do, you choose the appropriate, faculty, whether it's sensation or whether it's thought or whether it's emotion. And whatever is appropriate to the particular experience, you choose that medium and apply it and learn to inhibit all the other interferences or impulses we have to color and to, to impair our contact with real, direct experience. What Bion called direct experience, the Buddhist also says the same thing. It's called direct experience. Of course, there are differences at other levels between Bion and Buddhism, but that's one core. I bring this up because it's not just limited to Buddhism. It's out there. One famous Buddhist teaching is it's already present. The reality is already present. So searching for it is not always the answer, because searching for it means it's not present now. It's right within you, right in the environment. You have to look at how your perceptual processes.
And you have to make time for it, it seems like, too. Like, I love the idea that we focus so much in our lives anyways, like, okay, I gotta go to the gym or do something active today because I'm gonna feel horrible if I don't. And that's true, but we don't always make the space to do something that is just fully experiential, like gardening. I also love gardening, but I hardly make any time for it these days.
Well, it's the middle of winter. It's harder.
The middle of winter, fair enough. But do you know what I mean? It's like, I wonder how we can multiply those experiences.
I've been meditating.
Nastia, you're better at it than me.
Select activities that are really meaningful for you, like if it's gardening. At that time, then determine, as you garden, would you like it as primarily experience it as a sensual experience, or would you like to experience it as an affective or emotional experience? And then once you make that determination, then go for it and try to just be, and anything else that comes in between, you try to inhibit that. And the idea is to become at one-ment with that experience. You become at one-ment with it. And that can only come if you're fully relaxed. If you don't hold this agenda of, I've got to do this. The moment you have an agenda, it will not make it possible.
It's so true with regard to even just making this show or doing anything. It's like whenever you try to force things or get too serious, like we play a lot of music also, and it's like the same thing. Like when we start getting overly goal oriented about what we're doing in the studio and like the music we're making, and then we forget to actually enjoy what we're doing, and it just becomes this like nightmare of productivity overtaking. Even you could do that with gardening, really, where you're just there's weeds everywhere.
It's also, I think, important to do that. When we're talking about, gardening, a lot of people they live in a city and they don't have access to a garden. And one of the things I'll find, like, let's say I'm working on a task and, my daughter texts me and suddenly I thought she was going, she wants to be picked up early. So there's this aversion to, I have to break from my task. And now there's this thought I'm being put in, there's this whole train of mental phenomena. And there's this aspect of the world. How am I relating to the situation? This way of being, my way of being consumed with these thoughts of, I'm being put out or I'm frustrated. Okay, I could shift my way of being to, I'm going to be the good father. Okay, that's a different way of being. But another way of being is, I just need to take care of this. It's something arises that's unexpected and it's aversive or, it just is. I just need to take care of it. And all the tension drains away and it's like, okay, how do I close my document, making sure I can pick up where I left off, turn off the computer, go out to the car, go get her. Or if I have to do a task, I go downstairs and I find that, this thing, something broke, or there's a mess I didn't expect, or, there's all these opportunities to say, okay, I can be aversive to, there's an aversion and that's unease. And then that takes over my thoughts because those feelings are uncomfortable. And now I'm creating a way of being. I'm essentially creating a self or practicing being a self that's really not that pleasant to be around. Or I could practice being a self. This just has to be taken care of. It just is. And I'm involved in the experience and then it's done. And when it's done, then, okay, I move on to the next experience.
Mm-hmm.
And
my brother once said something to me before he passed away about this is like just telling himself at all times, like, this is just what I'm doing right now. Like if I'm on this long road trip or I have to drive to the doctor or whatever, it's just like, okay, well, now I'm driving. And isn't this like, driving's actually pretty fun when I think about it, or like whatever you're doing, really just doing it fully 100% and just being there and really being careful to be okay with this is your life and this is what it means to be alive and experience and control this car or do whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah, I think maybe one way of looking at the difference between I'll call it a more Eastern versus a more Western perspective is the Western, we're consumed with nouns. What is it? What is it? What is it? I think at least my experience of Buddha is reality is much more a set of verbs. And we miss them because we spend so much time looking at the nouns. And that may be one way of thinking. What I'm a verb, or I'm a set of verbs. What am I doing? What are the processes I'm engaging in? That's who I really am. And verbs don't show up, as concrete objects. They're processes.
And we are too, which is really crazy. Like, a human being is much better conceived of as some sort of unfolding process rather than an actual discrete material object. Our atoms change from minute to minute, but still we have this sense of continuity.
And yet we persist.
And yet we persist. Some part of us persists, yeah.
I mean, something that this leads me to is the commercialization of mindfulness and the way that it's used as this corporate tool to quell the workers and to
because there's a danger in telling people not to experience the torture that they're experiencing.
Yeah, because I think that modernity is pretty. I don't know what the right word for is. I think that it's pretty panicky. I think that people really want to be great. I think that we live in a world right now where the thing that people want is they want to be on the stage and they want to be able to achieve things and they want to be known for the things that they do. And a lot of people are in jobs that are necessary in order to survive, but they're not necessarily a place where they can thrive. And I feel like mindfulness is this thing that's put onto them to just kind of, to help them take it without necessarily...
It has that potential for abuse, I guess, is kind of the bottom line. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, mindfulness is, more than $1 billion industry. It's a huge commercial enterprise now. And, even researchers are not, subtly influenced by that, And therefore, what we see is, researchers making claims or implying claims which their research don't necessarily bear out. And I think that's partly because of the commercial aspect of mindfulness impacting serious researchers. I mean, these are researchers who have, tenure, who have years of research experience, very credible, but may not be willing to, really spell out exactly how far mindfulness that they've been studying works or does not work. Or even when they are, they might do so in a highly scientific, conservative forum. But when they come to the public, they might sing a very different tune. I know a couple of well-known researchers who do that when they are at the neuroscience scientific meeting, annual meeting. They will present a very limited, if about effectiveness of mindfulness as being preliminary, something that has to be still studied because of this methodological, conceptual, and other issues. But when they are in the public, they might fall victim to this whole commercial, presentation of it exist in the public domain. And that's something I found that, it's hard to challenge. It's hard to, I've known some researchers who try to speak out, but their voices are heard. Maybe a newspaper might pick it up and report on what they said. But after a few months, it no longer receives any traction. Whereas on the other side, the commercial aspect is covered repeatedly, if not in major newspapers who might run it once, but then in magazines. And then from major magazines to New Age magazines and so on, the cycle keeps feeding itself. So the commercialization is, I found it's more than meets the eye. It's a whole industry that feeds on itself. And I don't see any challenge to it really, except occasionally, someone might speak against it.
Yeah, I think. Are you familiar with Ronald Purser's book, Mindfulness?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know you are, Lobsang. I didn't know if our hosts were. Yeah, his book, I think, he talks really more, not just, Lobsang's referring to how mindfulness may not be as effective as some of these public claims, but he actually goes into the darker side where this idea of non-judgment is being used to suppress dissent. Thoughts are just thoughts.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about when I broke up in this topic a bit. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a great idea for a corporation that's stuffing people into cubicles or something, just tune it out or something. Yeah.
Well, there was, I think it was in his book or maybe an article where there was it was a conference put on by Google, and some activists got on stage and, protested about how what was being done by the tech companies was increasing homelessness in San Francisco. And, the security was called and they escorted them off. And then immediately was this sort of mindfulness. Well, thoughts are just thoughts and we're not going to judge, and they have their opinion and it's just their opinion. It's like, wait a minute. The Buddha wasn't about ignoring social injustice. That was not his purpose. There's certain things, and that's where I use the idea of, you have to be able to assess and evaluate and think, these are helpful, these are useful, these thoughts are going to get us, and they're going to take us in this direction. And is it a direction that really we want to go in? And is it helpful for other people? What are the consequences? You need discernment.
Yeah, that's something that I've always wondered about, this tenet that life is suffering. And the goal is to sort of to accept that on some level. Is that true, or is that something that you acknowledge?
Well, you want to transcend it, right? And as I understand the Buddhist trend.
Yeah, the Buddhist tradition, suffering may not be a good translation, but it's widely used. Even the Buddhists themselves use it. But really, it's dissatisfaction is more what the actual meaning is. You can buy a young employee might work and be motivated because he wants to buy this beautiful car he's dreamt of since he was a child, and then he buys the car, and for like a couple of months, that's everything. He forgets his family, he forgets his wife, whatever, and that's the car. He washes it every weekend and he takes it for a drive, etc., etc. His whole life is imbued by that, driven by that car. And then after 6 months, he begins to, it's no longer the same feeling. And then after 2 years, it's just a car. And then he looks for, there's this latest one, other type of car. And his attention, the moment he finds that, then the value of this further decreases. And that's what Buddha meant by dissatisfaction. That's what he meant by suffering. Suffering, he didn't mean like pain or physical suffering per se. He really meant at its core that it's dissatisfaction. And then coupled with it, there are these 4 core invariants of life you cannot avoid. One is birth, one is sickness, one is old age, and one is death. So coupled with the dissatisfaction we face, there's this underlying governing principle of life. And the Buddha suggests that instead of waiting for your loved one to die and then say, I have to change my life now, why not embrace the reality that faces you, that you'll get sick, you'll become old, and you'll die, and embrace that as a part of living, rather than doing everything to avoid facing that. And that's like the principle of exposure therapy, right? Whatever you fear, don't avoid it, because that leads to anxiety. Rather, face it, and that's where you find relief. I'm kind of putting it in simplistic terms, but that's what the Buddha meant, yeah.
And I kind of equate that to the idea of the hedonic treadmill, where you want and then you get it, and then there's always something new to want.
And people do this with other people too, right? With their relationships.
Relationships,
You see people just cycle through romantic partners or even friend groups and even just topics of interest, right? Someone can go from being like a super passionate, whatever, baseball fans of being super into, after their baseball years have faded, maybe they get into politics instead, and they're like constantly searching for this next thing.
Right.
Go ahead.
So this is where I come in with this idea of unease or dissatisfaction or discontent. So reducing unease is pleasurable. We get what we want, we avoid what so pleasure comes from a reduction in unease. But think about it. If I've reduced unease and now I'm content, unease is low, right? I can't reduce it. It's already low. So I can't feel pleasure. If unease is low, if I'm content, I can't feel pleasure. It's like if you eat, you're hungry, you eat, you're no longer hungry. Well, now eating doesn't do anything for you. So when we're content, unease is low, we can't feel pleasure, which then actually becomes a source of unease. Okay, unease, contentment is unstable. We get uneasy about being content. We look for, that's why kids, parents wonder, why do the kids, everything's going well and now they're getting into trouble. Right, everything was going well. And so they got antsy and the unease started. And so now they're doing stuff that will bring up unease and then it'll be able to be reduced. And that's actually, I think, it's a very important loop in our nervous system because it leads us to discover. I mean, if contentment was stable, we'd get content and we'd still be living in caves. We'd still have childhood diseases. We wouldn't have indoor plumbing. It also, the problem is that sometimes that desire, that the contentment's unstable. We get into trouble. We get into things we probably that are reducing unease, but they make things more difficult. And so, I think one of the powerful things about Buddhist practice is you start to notice, okay, this is just unease. What do I want to do with it? How do I want I can be uneasy and relieve that unease by going and getting a few drinks. Or maybe I can check and see if, go connect with my neighbor and have a good conversation, or I can have, some good time with my family. So how do I use this unease? It's using it in the service of reducing difficulty. And that requires, all these techniques, I think, are really designed to help us do that. And that's what I think, life is dissatisfaction. You have to learn how to use it. And that's your path out of dissatisfaction. When you're not constantly trying to satisfy yourself, you're saying, wait a minute, let me explore this.
The crazy thing about our modern civilization is that we have technologically harnessed the ability to control unease to a degree that we've started generating more externalities as a result of that process. Like new sources of unease are popping up. And it's almost like a whack-a-mole situation where as soon as you deal with one thing, there's like 30, the pharmaceutical industry calls them side effects, but I assume there's psychological side effects too. And just, it seems like every time we make ourselves comfortable, we've got, new disasters. What do you make of that?
And especially, I want to add to that, the kind of the looming, what I personally think is a disaster, is this quest to end death and old age. Right? Well, because that's, if you look at what a lot of the money is going into, it's longevity research.
Right. That's right.
It's being able to, people openly talk about wanting to end death. And that to me feels like...
We've had them on the show.
Yeah, we have had them on the show. We've also had people on the show that are into wireheading, which is this transhumanist philosophy that you'll be able to genetically alter the human brain in order to increase the set point of pleasure. And so what you should orient yourself towards is genetically engineering bliss in people. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think those, this is, there's, human desire is, of course, endless, when one is fulfilled with one, it's only natural to search for something else. And in a larger extent, I think this is what's being played out. And I'm sure also, there will be some limited, inroads any of these endeavors will make. Like we've seen, like with medication, when I remember at the university in 2000, it was kind of, we were all feeling like a psychologist. I was feeling as a psychologist, gee, wow, this is the age of medication. These miracle antidepressants and would pop up, and this would like take care of all the psychiatric concerns, because at that time, that was what was being focused on and was being propagated implicitly, like this is the answer. And we were like concerned, gee, but the truth was it doesn't pan out, like now there are concerns about antidepressant, in recent literature showing that it may not really be, addressing the issue of depression. So I think that's how it will play out, and it's very tempting once you kind of fall in love with the idea you come up with, you're not going to let it go. It's like, some of the most narcissistic people in the world, apart from politicians and lawyers, are psychologists, in this mental health.
I would go so far as to say scientists at large. Yeah.
Yeah. Like look at we have nearly 500 different therapies in psychology. And yet it really comes down to two that are kind of solid. Psychoanalysis and CBT, which is more research-based, evidence-based. But yet we have all this, and that's a reflection of, of narcissism. And it's very hard in this culture, like you mentioned earlier, everybody loves to like come up with something new, something fancy, something that will put them on the stage. And you can see that being, I think that's really the issue. And the thing is, of course, because they are passionate about it, they're attached to it, they will make inroads into a certain degree. But, it won't be the answer, and then something else will come up. And in Buddhism, we call this the cycle of, degeneration and regeneration. Something that comes will stay for a while, and then it will degenerate. But it doesn't mean it's disappeared, because something else will regenerate from it. And this is called the cycle of existence. In Buddhism, we call it samsara. It means just a cycle that just plays out again and again. Look at ourselves. I mean, we have all the knowledge we have about in the modern age that our predecessors didn't have. Yet the same negative emotions control us. Look at America today. In many ways, the two parties are very primitive, the way they think and way they behave. Like there are congressmen, if you ask them, what is the solution, how do we go forward, they will talk simply about how the other side are extremists, and extremists have to be gotten rid of. And that's, implying a very primitive, violent attitude. Now, if you take such a stance, there's no room for dialogue. And if there's no dialogue, there's no growth. So you'll see this. And we are part of that. Most of us stay away from it because it's so depressingly. And because it's so depressant, it makes us complacent and disengaged. And this feed on itself. This is the degenerative part. But then the regenerative part will take different forms.
And it makes you feel so helpless too, really, when you feel like nothing you do really matters. You look at voting records versus outcomes politically, they're like completely detached from one another, and you're just like, There
was a really depressing Yale study, I think last year, which was like, voting doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Where you're just...
Yeah, I remember when I came to the United States 20 years ago, If there was someone on the street who had a car breakdown, other cars would stop right away and ask. It was just spontaneous. Anywhere I went, that would happen. But now, if someone is severely hurt, people look and just drive on. There's that indifference. This complacency has the danger of turning into what Buddhists called indifference. And indifference is something that takes us into a dark path as a society, and it ripples down. This indifference, you can see it ripple down. At least I live in Los Angeles, so where there are safe areas and there are unsafe areas, but safe areas are never safe.
Whoa, there's safe areas in Los Angeles?
That's what I was going to say. The safe areas are never safe because it's surrounded by unsafe situations happening all the time. And and most people keep a blind eye to it. They just say, oh, yeah, okay. And then, I have to go and pick up my child. That's how I experience this all the time in the environment I live. When parents, did you hear about, I have to now go home quickly because I have to do this and that. That's
And this
avoidance just now and turning into complacency. But it will turn into indifference. And indifference means you don't care what happens to the other person.
Yeah, and then that's just going to undermine the entire civilization eventually when people get so cut off from one another they can't relate, they can't even unite themselves against common problems anymore. Absolutely. Because they're so cut off.
You don't see it. No common effort to unite against glaring problems right in our front steps, like people living in poverty, homelessness, crime. It's mind-boggling. Whereas in underdeveloped or developing countries, these things they are now beginning to address quite successfully. So we have a long road, but it's at the same time, it's a process of regeneration and degeneration. So I don't believe that the world will end. I believe it's a cycle, but still.
Well, it's certainly ended many times before, it seems like. I mean, civilizations have a history of collapsing under their own weight at some point. And some of that is imperial, but some of it must be psycho-spiritual as well, where people lose the ability to feel like they can influence their daily, their environment.
Yeah, it seems like at some point it gets to be so big that this is a problem of modern life, right? That we're no longer part of small communities, we're part of this larger community. A lot of people are associating with people primarily through social media or online, and it creates the situation where you go out into the world and you're like, I don't know any of these people. They're not related to me. True. We don't share interests. We don't have a shared experience, and because of that, they're meaningless to me. And that, I think, is what shakes a society apart, is that you just don't owe anything to anybody.
Right, but I think there's in fact, I put this up on a comment recently. It was talking about how nothing changes, and people are trying to elect this president or that president and nothing changes. And I said, first of all, in politics, it's run. People who are rich want to run things so they can stay rich. That's just the way people are. It's not that they're bad people, or that's people. That's so in a political. I don't know of any political system that's really served the needs of the populace. It's always been served the needs of those in power. But what you can do is you can connect with the people locally. You can connect with the people around you. And I use the analogy. Yes, you're only lighting one candle. But if everybody lights a candle, you shed a lot of light. And what we have to do is stop looking for a bonfire to start, because either the wood's wet or it's going to cause a conflagration. Getting in the habit of just talking to people. You find out stuff about you. who are your neighbors? Not your friends on Facebook. Who are your next door neighbors? Who are the people who live in? And I think people naturally do that. The people the patients I work with, they're very open to that. A lot of people do that spontaneously. And I think what we miss is that the fact is that that's really important. People do it, but when we don't realize that we're doing something that's important, we tend to disparage it, or we don't put energy into it. We don't make it a priority. And
well, you don't get money for it. I guess that's what it comes down to, and that's like our monolithic value structure. I mean, not even like on a personal level, but just from the fact that these corporations that are making a lot of the decisions in terms of even our own financial futures, like to the extent that we have invested in our retirement funds and so forth, they're fundamentally driven by a single metric, which is growth. And all of our decisions end up being based on that. I mean, to the fact that we've relegated our healthcare to this corporate structure as well. It's like, how can it make human decisions if we have the whole thing tuned to this single value?
Right. Well, growth at all costs. I mean, if you think about a body, the different types of cells in the body, what type of cell has the value grow at all costs? Growth is the only priority.
The really bad one.
It's cancer cells.
Yeah.
That's what cancer is. It's grow. I'm going to grow and I'm going to get bigger at the expense of everything else. And that's what we have in our. I mean, when growth and greed is the priority, you have a body as our social system. If it's a body, cancer is encouraged. We encourage cells to get cancerous. Well, I don't. Connecting with neighbors and stuff. I mean, yes, I'm under no illusions that that's going to change the political system, but it is something we can do. And if we do look out for each other, we're going to be better off than if we don't, if we just throw up our hands in despair.
In the context of cancerous growth, I came across something really interesting. We interviewed Nick Lane a couple of days ago, and he wrote this book called Transformer, where he talks about life as being defined by the way that it channels energy, and like metabolic energy for him, because he's a biochemist. But he makes this case that I'd never seen before, that if you take a cancerous cell, our current paradigm is the fact that there's genetic mutations and that cell will always be cancerous. But you can take it and you can transplant it into a healthy environment, and it's controlled by its environment, and it doesn't cause a tumor somewhere else. Like, there's a point where it becomes metastatic, which that's not the case. But prior to metastasis, if you take that cell that's growing a tumor and you put it into a healthy environment, it will cease. It will not be able to create a tumor anymore, which I'd never heard before. And I've just been thinking a lot about it the last few days.
So that would mean if you have a very healthy social environment where the real value is do good unto others, that sort of thing, then even, someone who's naturally maybe more greedy than others, it would attenuate. And so they might acquire some things, but then they're going to actually work, they'll be more likely to do good for their environment. And it's interesting.
And I think about this a lot in context of the American idea of coolness, where to be cool is to never say that somebody's doing something bad. It's almost this kind of like non-judgmental thing of distancing yourself from what's happening around you and not being the one who's like, hey, that's really messed up and you shouldn't do that. And I think that there is this, if people were able to develop an internal sense of what is good and what is bad that comes from listening to themselves and dealing with the unease and focusing on that and being able to kind of maintain their own garden, then maybe we could get to the point where it would be easier for us to kind of universally be like, hey, I don't think we should tolerate that behavior. It risks too much to allow it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important point you're bringing up, because, if you look at the Buddha, I think, he, in many ways, the history books will tell you that Buddhism emerged as a revolution against the caste system that was prevalent in India at that time. And to a large extent it was. But also there's another side to the Buddha, which was he understood human nature. He understood that he was. So he never actively tried to stop wars, but rather he encouraged the kings to look into their own souls, into seeing what is beneficial. And I think Job made a good distinction here. Rather than seeing good versus evil, the Buddhists were smart enough to see that that's not helpful. What is helpful is to see whether something is beneficial or, as Joe put it, helpful versus unhelpful. And I think that's how the Buddha kind of approached the social issues. Instead of telling all the kings to stop wars and chide them for it or rebuke them for it, he took this more long-term view of encouraging them through parables. He told them stories. He gave examples, and to explain how their state of mind and how their desires and hatred and above all ignorance kind of is informing their decisions.
Yeah, and the original Christian traditions were not so far different from that too.
Right.
Yeah, I think
but if you look at the way things, how we perceive things, here is we say we have to stop wars, and people who want to go to war are bad or extremist, and that's an important, I think, part. But the real issue we should also be focusing on is to encourage people who are in that state of mind to kind of, which is a long-term process, is to look into themselves as to why they adapt such violent means and what motivates them to do so. And that was the Buddha's approach. So he was never fully successful in directly stopping wars, but he was very successful in encouraging several of the kings to give up warring on their own. So if it starts with a few, then at least that's a major, shift in the dynamics. But if we maintain polarities, we have to do this is bad and this is good. I think it's a never-ending battle with no change in the extreme positions. And I think that's what the Buddha kind of eventually discovered for himself, that you can't change people's behavior right away. And to try to do that polarizes them and maintains the status quo. But I think and we see this play out in the modern, in the modern culture and traditions. Okay, so
yeah, I mean we've covered a lot of topics. Do you have more?
I think we could put a pin in it. Yeah, it's enormous. I mean, and it's played out across the East and West, which is really fascinating. Like, I just can't stop being struck by the parallels to both the Stoic tradition and also the early Christian tradition before the bureaucracy of the church inserted itself into matters. I don't know how we'll be able to implement these in our civilization before it's too late. Exactly. I'm not like a doomer or anything, but Nasty's a doomer. I just see, I love the idea of localism. I love the idea of us taking control over our environments. I just don't know how to fight against the overwhelming pressures and incentive structures that are fundamentally focused on growth as a mono-value system. And it's just a real crisis for us to all figure out in terms of, I think even in terms of combating these free-floating anxieties that everyone's experiencing. And yeah, it's just a huge topic. I don't expect that we're going to be able to solve that in one session.
But I think that we have come to some important lessons, which is that the progress begins internally, right? It's so well known that it's almost trite to say so, but clean your own room, manage your own garden, focus on your own ability to escape from this drive towards eternal growth and always more and more and more. And if you can do that, and you can impart it on your children or your friends or your community, then maybe a few generations down the line, we won't have people that are interested in running, multinational war industries.
And focus on the wisdom, not the mysticism too, right?
Yeah.
Like really anything we can
I
do.
think that's
really good.
That's wonderfully put.
So let's put a pin in it for today. We're going to keep studying these issues and talk to more people, and maybe down the road we can talk to you guys again. And, once we've learned a bit more and have a bit more depth to the perspective. But it's been really illuminating to talk to both of you, and I really appreciate you giving the time to this project so that we can sort some of these ideas out and hopefully move forward.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you so much again. I really
Thank you.
appreciate your time and giving us this opportunity.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. We're going to figure it all out eventually. All right. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.